Chapter 3, the molecules of life. So in this chapter, we will focus on the molecules of life, which are organic compounds. And what the term organic refers to is that these are molecules or compounds that are based on the carbon atom. So let's look at the cell, and the cell is mostly water. In fact, you can almost think of the cell as a really elaborate bag of water, because cells can be up to 80% water, depending on the organism or the plant or animal that we may be talking about. So the rest of the cell consists mostly of carbon-based molecules. So these are the molecules of life. And the reason why carbon is so important is that carbon, because of its ability to make covalent bonds with other atoms, carbon is able to form large complex molecules that are important to allow life's functions at the cellular level. And then that transmits or transfers to life's functions at the tissue level, and then the organ level, then the organ system level, and then ultimately the entire organism. And if you're a fan of sci-fi, science fiction, or maybe not even that, you've probably heard the term carbon-based life form when they talk about, looking for aliens, because carbon is such a flexible atom in terms of forming complex molecules that they actually look for carbon when they're trying to find evidence of extracellular molecules that could be hints of life in other places outside of Earth. So organic compounds are carbon-based molecules. And that means proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and then the nucleic acids being DNA and RNA. So let's get into carbon and its unique bonding ability, and we'll cover a little bit of carbon chemistry here. And I've lost my cursor. There it is. Okay. So carbon. So again, carbon is a very versatile atom. If we look at the little framework here, or the molecular structure of these different organic molecules, you notice that carbon is centrally located in this framework, and then the line, if you remember, indicates a chemical bond, happens to be a covalent bond, and the little lines indicate two electrons being shared by these two atoms, carbon and hydrogen. I think we covered that, well, in chapter 1 or chapter 2. And the, whoops, where's my cursor? The thing goes to sleep all the time. So you can see that carbon can form up to 1, 2, 3, 4 chemical bonds with things like hydrogen or with other carbons. And because of that, it's kind of like a fancy, erector set where using carbon as this central framework, molecules can get pretty large and pretty elaborate and can even form ring type structures. And then the two lines mean a double chemical bond, meaning an interaction there of 4 electrons. Okay? So carbon can make covalent bonds with up to 4 other atoms, and the other atoms can be different things, not just hydrogen or carbon, but many of the other elements. Okay? So carbon can bind to other carbon atoms, forming essentially an endless variety of organic carbon-based molecules. Even things like gasoline, or the fat in cheese, or the proteins in meat, the carbohydrates in bread, are all carbon-based, large, elaborate molecules. So a little bit on carbon and its bonding ability with this little video. Hopefully it will play for us. There you go.
Organic molecules may vary in length, and the carbon backbones of organic molecules may vary in length and in location of single and double bonds. Molecules may be straight or branched, and may even contain rings of atoms.
So just a little short video there to show you the elaborate and complex organic carbon-based molecules that are made possible because of the bonding capacity or ability of carbon. And these are all really relatively small examples. A typical protein can have up to 500 individual carbon atoms linked together with all the other atoms attached to it. And some of the larger proteins can have thousands of carbon atoms. So the carbon atoms of our organic carbon-based compounds can also bond with other elements. The most common ones are oxygen and nitrogen, in addition to hydrogen. Okay? And then down here, we see different representations of the same molecule. And this molecule down here is CH4, one carbon, four hydrogens. It's called methane, and it's an organic molecule or a carbon-based molecule because its central atom is carbon. So this is a structural formula that gives a good representation of the actual atoms involved and their binding or their bond formation. This is a ball and stick model that gives you a better representation of the three-dimensional shape of this molecule. It's kind of like a pyramid type shape molecule where all of the hydrogen atoms are equally distant apart, forming this kind of unique shape. And then the space-filled molecule gives you a better sense of the actual three-dimensional shape of the molecule. But all three of these representations are of the same methane molecule. So methane is found abundantly in natural gas, like your gas stove, for example, and is actually produced by prokaryotes. If you remember that, these are simple single-celled organisms that do not have a nuclei, like bacteria or the archaea that are found in swamps. So that smelly gas that's produced is called swamp gas, and it's mostly methane. And also in the digestive tract of grazing animals, and it's produced as a byproduct of their breakdown of plant material and grasses, for example. So when cows burp or fart, they are releasing a fair amount of methane. So larger organic molecules exist in things like gasoline and also in important fuels in animals like in you. And think of the fats or proteins or carbohydrates. This is a simple, relatively small dietary fat molecule represented here, but some of the fat molecules are much larger. And we harness energy by them by breaking them down, and every chemical bond that's broken releases some energy that can be transferred ultimately to what's called ATP, which is the direct molecular cellular energy of our cells during cellular metabolism at our mitochondria. So the energy-rich part of fat molecules have this basic structure that is somewhat similar to gasoline in the sense of it's somewhat of a linear molecule. The thing with the dietary fat, though, is that there are three of these linear molecules, and they're referred to as fatty acid chains. Fatty acid chains. So many of our dietary fats, have three of them. So what makes the molecules different? It is the number of carbons and hydrogens or other molecules that are attached to them, and how they are arranged physically in space. So in organic compounds, again, carbon-based molecules, the groups of atoms that are directly involved in chemical reactions are referred to as functional groups. So here's a fairly elaborate carbon-based molecule. There's lots of carbon here, some nitrogens interspersed, some oxygens in red, one sulfur there and one phosphate. And this group, which is called the phosphate group, which you actually don't need to know, but it's a functional group. It will be involved in chemical reactions, or it can be at least. This is another functional group that's nitrogen-based. Here's a functional group that's just oxygen. Here's a functional group that's an OH. And so forth. So these functional groups give this particular molecule its particular chemical reactivity, or its ability to react with other molecules in terms of chemical reactions. Okay, so that's what functional groups are. Association of atoms, even if it's just one, that's attached to the carbon framework of an organic molecule that responds in chemical reactions with other molecules. Often with molecules referred to as enzymes, and we'll talk about enzymes when we get to proteins. So each functional group plays a particular role in the chemical reactions of these molecules, or another way to think about it is these functional groups give molecules their particular chemical characteristics. So giant molecules from smaller building blocks. So many of our life's molecules are huge macromolecules, like thousands and thousands of carbons and all the other molecules attached to them. So this thing, even though it looks elaborate, is actually relatively tiny when it comes to talking about some of the large biological molecules that are called macromolecules, right? Macro for big. So there are three categories of the biological macromolecules. Okay? Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids in terms of really large molecules and having an elaborate carbon-based backbone. Okay? There are 4 biological molecules in general. Okay? Carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. All right? So one reason why the lipids are not included in the biological macromolecules is because most of the lipids do not get as large as some of the carbohydrates or some of the proteins or some of the nucleic acids. So potentially a little source of confusion here. The biological macromolecules, normally we talk about carbs, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. But there are 4 biological molecules in total, those carbohydrates, those proteins, nucleic acids, and then lipids. Another name for lipids is fats. Another name for carbohydrates is sugars. So giant molecules from smaller building blocks. So macromolecules are referred to as polymers. And what a polymer is just a very large molecule, and polymers get to be very large molecules by linking smaller building blocks together by forming a chemical bond. So in the little example here, there's a relatively short polymer, meaning a somewhat large molecule, and it is being chemically bound to a small building block molecule referred to as a monomer. Mono meaning one. So monomer means a simple, often one carbon based small molecule that can be linked to another molecule to form a longer, larger molecule. So the monomers are like the building blocks of the larger polymers. Okay? So here, a monomer is being linked to a chemical bond, a short polymer to make a longer polymer. And this is a very small example. In real life, your biological molecules, macromolecules, are much longer than this example here. But this is just showing you how the large molecules are built from smaller building blocks. Okay? So the smaller building block molecules are called monomers. And carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins are built this way at the cellular level. Right? If your cell needs to build a large protein polymer, it links shorter molecules with protein monomers together to make the large polymer. So this type of chemical reaction, notice what happens. In green are the carbon molecules. They're not labeled, but that's a carbon molecule. It has a chemical bond with this OH group, functional group, by the way. This carbon-based molecule, and that's carbon, has a chemical bond with that hydrogen, which is its functional group for this reaction. So what happens is when these two molecules come together, this larger one and this small monomer, the chemical bond with hydrogen in this monomer